As the world watched and waited over the weekend, nations lined up in vocal support of military intervention in Syria, notably France and Saudi Arabia, while others voiced their opposition, notably the United Kingdom and Russia. And America, a president that wants to strike and a Congress that's thinking about it. Joining us now for the latest on the conflict and the politics at play around the globe. In Beirut, Lebanon, via Skype, Rami Khouri, director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. In Istanbul, Turkey, via Skype, Stephen Starr, journalist and author of Revolt in Syria, Eyewitness to the Uprising. And with us here in studio, Kamran Bokhari, Vice President of Middle Eastern and South Asian Affairs at the global intelligence company Stratfor, and Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst. And as I welcome you two here in our studios and our other two guests halfway around the world to our program tonight, I want to start our discussion by reading something that David Sanger wrote in the New York Times a couple of days ago to kickstart our discussion here. He writes, "There is an argument that Mr. Obama's own caution about foreign interventions put him in this box. Horrific as the August 21st chemical weapons attack was, it was no more horrific than the conventional attacks that caused the deaths of 100,000 Syrians. Those prompted only a minimal American response, international condemnations, some sporadic arms shipments for a ragtag group of rebels, and an understandable reluctance by an American president to get on the same side of the civil war as al-Nusra Front, an affiliate of al-Qaeda." All right, let's go to the region first. Rami, the United States is deciding right now whether to strike. In your view, should they?
They should not strike unilaterally. If there is a UN Security Council resolution that gives a strike legitimacy, then the U.S. and the Turks and the Arabs and anybody else who wants to be should be part of a collective international legitimate action. But unilaterally, the United States should not strike. It won't be effective. It'll cause great damage. It has no ethical base, and the consequences, as your own Bob Ray has recently written very wisely, the consequences cannot be really measured ahead of time. So no, they shouldn't strike. Stephen Starr in Istanbul, should the U.S. strike?
It's a difficult thing for me to say, being a reporter and covering the region. I think the consequences of not taking part in some extent and getting involved in some extent and sending a message to the Assad regime, whatever that may be, are far worse than simply letting things lie, letting things continue as they were. I think the Assad regime would be very happy to continue what it's been doing for the last 30 or so months. Something I feel has to be done.
Kamran Bokhari.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of should the United States strike at Syria. I mean, we have to look at it from the point of view of the American imperative. As the world's sole superpower, it cannot tolerate the use of chemical weapons. If you just say, okay, we're going to gloss over this, then tomorrow someone else is going to use it. So you set a bad precedent. And secondly, which is from the Obama administration's point of view is much more important, is that you can't draw a red line and then not deliver on it. You look like you don't mean business, and it sends the wrong message. So from the U.S. point of view, it does have to strike. The question is how.
How about from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, I think I agree that you can't allow people to just use chemical weapons and they're not have any consequences afterwards. And the second thing is that doing empathetic analysis, I mean, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of Obama and say, okay, can I just ignore this? And easily so. And so the answer is no, because you yourself said there's a red line, you cross it, we will act. And now that red line seemingly has been crossed, so there's time for action.
You've said seemingly, and that's going to open up a can of worms that we're going to look into a little bit later. Janice, a strike, yes or no?
Very, very reluctantly, yes, because this actually is not about Syria. It is about the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's about the Geneva Protocol. To the extent we have any norms in the international community at all, Steve, we have them against the use of chemical and biological weapons, against anybody, not only against your own civilians. You're right, there is a question of evidence still outstanding here, but assuming that that evidence is there, I think you have no choice. You can't let the use of chemical weapons go unnoticed, and it's not a matter of the numbers, it is a matter of an absolute taboo against the use of these kinds of weapons.
Can I follow up on that with you, Janice? And I'll get everybody else involved in this as well. David Sanger made the point in his piece that America was not considering an attack when 100,000 Syrians
Right.
were killed by conventional methods.
Right.
But 1,400, not to minimize the number, it's horrendous, but 1,400
Right.
as compared to 100,000
Right.
have now been killed by chemical weapons, and suddenly the U.S. is exercised.
So-
Why is gas different?
It is different. Gas is different. And I think that's a very important point to make. What is going on inside Syria is a civil war. And there is not a global norm that you intervene with force on one side or the other of a civil war. Why does gas matter? Because gas is a form of chemical weapon. And once you legitimate the use of chemical and biological weapons, which are just next up, if you allow those to go, and that's in fact what Obama did, he allowed repeated pinprick chemical attacks to go unpunished, and then we get the first large-scale use of chemical weapons since Saddam Hussein against
But dead
the
is
Kurds
dead.
in Khalafah.
Dead is dead. Why is
But
gas
dead
different?
isn't- No, dead really isn't dead, because in a fundamental way, countries go to war and populations go to war, and civil wars erupt. What the international community for close to 100 years has said is, since the end of World War I, you cannot gas populations even in the middle of a war. And that's the issue that is now before the international community, and the silence is frankly deafening, Steve.
Well, let me follow up with Rami on that. You know, some will argue that dead is dead, that whether you get killed by a bullet or whether you get killed by poison gas, at the end of the day, you're still dead. So why does some of the world want to make a distinction because of gas?
Well, I think the issue of the response to the gas use is really very complicated. It's not only about the issues that Janice mentioned, which I agree with her on the fact that these weapons are prohibited. I disagree with her that the United States has any kind of legal, moral, political, or ethical mandate to actually be the enforcer of these conventions. The UN Security Council is mandated to do that, not the American presidency. But they're different because the implications of these weapons being used in Syria, first of all, has implications for people in the region, particularly Israel and Hezbollah and Jordan and Iran and Turkey. And possibly if these get into the hands of some of the Islamist militant terrorist groups, the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant and these groups, this is something that frightens the whole world, because some of these groups might want to carry out attacks, as they have done, in Europe, North America, Australia, or other places. So there is a qualitative difference in the implications of the use of chemical weapons, but I think there's a difference between why these weapons should not be used and who's responsible for making sure that they're not used again. And that's, I think, where there's a real difference.
Rami, can I just intervene for 1 second? I mean, there is, of course, this hagiography against the UN Security Council. We all need a UN Security Council resolution. Effectively, what that does is farm out ultimate decision and responsibility to Russia and China, which are inevitably going to veto this for their own good reasons.
So is there another good housekeeping seal of approval out there short of a UN?
There isn't.
NATO?
Well, there is not really a good housekeeping seal of approval, but the argument is, is that the most important thing? Or do we look, in fact, at the Geneva Conventions, at the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and Syria hasn't signed, by the way, and do we just say this is a clear violation? And is there not then room, when the Security Council is deadlocked, as it's been repeatedly again and again, is there not room for a group of countries to act together?
A coalition of the willing.
That's right.
Kamran.
I think there is the legal side, definitely international law, Janice and Rami made the arguments. But I think that there is a reality, and the reality supersedes legality, which is that everybody's looking at the United States. What are you going to do about it? And the United States has tried to look at others and say, well, what are you going to do about it? Looking at Turkey, and it needs help. You know, it's not in the interest. It's not as if the United States wants to go in unilaterally. No. This is not its desire. We've not seen any indication of this.
But the rest of the world expects it.
The rest of the world expects it, and therefore we can't just stick with legality. We have to look at, you know, the geopolitics, which is the geopolitical reality on the ground.
Well, Stephen, I'm going to get you then to start this next part of our discussion, which is, of course, the people in Washington now have, it looks like, I guess, about a week and a half until Congress comes back to think about the what if we do's and what if we don'ts of a military strike. So let's get into that discussion here. If the United States were to launch some kind of military attack on Syria to punish them for their use of chemical weapons, what do you believe would be the implications that would follow?
I think, first of all, they're most likely to strike a select number of military complexes. Perhaps in the rural parts of the country, there are hundreds of government military bases in certain parts of the desert and in areas far from civilian areas. I think there's a space there for the U.S. to do something militarily, but at the same time be careful about, mindful at least, of civilian casualties and that. The Assad regime, having lived there for 5 years, the Assad regime does not know how to negotiate. Negotiation is not something it's used to. It is. I feel that if there is no steps taken, the Assad regime, as I said, will continue to fight this out. And I feel, you know, certainly here in Turkey, the Turkish government is fearful of going alone. Lebanon, of course, won't take on the Syrian government to any extent. Similarly, in Jordan and Iraq has its own issues too. It's simply, and NATO also on a broader scale won't act independently. So it's simply, I think it sits with the United States and Congress to send a message to Bashar al-Assad. And I think to send a message is a very bad kind of line to use, I think, but at its essence, it's a really important thing to do, I feel.
Rami Khouri, you have already told us that you think a missile strike is a bad idea. What is your concern about what would follow a U.S. attack?
Well, if we look at the historical record going back something like maybe 15 years, the United States, with others, has attacked with missiles Sudan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, the drones all over the Middle East and South Asia. And in almost every one of these situations, it has not achieved its basic political aim and has left behind a wreck that is far more dangerous than what was there before the United States attacked. In the last month, 800 people were killed in Iraq. In the month before that, 1,000 people were killed in Iraq. And Iraq is a disintegrating country. Iraq and Syria are the biggest combined territory for the production of jihadi terrorists now, who train there, are mobilized, are equipped, and go out all over the Middle East and all over the world. This is what the United States militarism unilaterally and British militarism did in Iraq, and it's almost likely, very likely, that we will have the same consequence if it's a unilateral American attack without sanctions from the United Nations. And I agree with Janice, it's tough in the Security Council, but this is the system that has been designed by the world. If the United States or Canada or somebody doesn't like what's going on in the Security Council, the response is to do better diplomacy. The United States is going to leave behind a wreck if it attacks Syria with more refugees, more terrorism, and more problems, sectarianism. But also, we have the situation where the United States is trying to address Syria without talking to the two most important people who influence Syria, who are Russia and Iran. I mean, they're barely on talking terms with Russia, and they're not on talking terms with Iran. So this is ludicrous. This is amateurish diplomacy by an American power that looks to unilateral militarism as a great psychological tonic for its confusion about how to do foreign policy. And we've had this now for 15, 20 years, and it's about time to stop, I think, and find a better way to do it.
Janice, Rami did give a fairly impressive list of countries off the top of that answer where American intentions and what happened after that didn't end in a lot of glory.
Right, and he left out Yemen to strengthen his case.
So if you did attack Syria, what makes you think the outcome would be better or different this time?
You know, here's where I agree with Rami, but not for his reasons. There really isn't a good military option here, Steve. And paradoxically, the result, and I also agree that the diplomacy has been so poor, so inept. And the result of the poor diplomacy that the Obama administration has actually used, paradoxically, is Obama is now going to have to bargain for congressional support, and he's going to have to do something that is more robust, that uses more force than he would have had he managed things better. He's in a lose-lose situation. Let's just walk through what happens. If it's a very limited kind of strike, the kind that Stephen talked about, you know, Assad is going to thumb his nose a week later, and it's not inconceivable that he might in fact use chemical weapons again. So where are we in this cycle of violence? If it's more robust, as Rami said, you can't escape killing civilians. There are no surgical strikes.
Or maybe blowback either.
And there are certainly lots of possibilities for blowback. So the world as a whole now finds itself in front of awful choices: legitimate the use of chemical weapons by looking the other way, or do something that has the potential for escalation, or on the other hand, is considered a joke by the Assads, who look at this and say, is that what the United States can do? It is the fault of the United States that we find ourselves in the position that we find ourselves. So I share the criticism, we just differ on the way out here.
Kamram, what do you see as the consequences of a U.S. strike?
Well, I'd like to say that I agree with the consequences laid out by my co-panelists here, but I'd like to say that the United States is not oblivious of these consequences. It is very much, it understands what is at stake here, and therefore, what kind of strike can you have? Let's talk militarily. You know, if, as Janice said, if it's a pinprick strike and the storm passes and Assad says, okay, so
got through that, okay.
Lived through that one.
And so it sends the wrong message. But then once you've already, even if it is a limited strike, a very pinprick symbolic strike, you still open up a Pandora's box, you set up a precedent that then the United States can't just say, oh, well, let's go back to business. No, we can't do that because you've opened the door into a new room. But let's say that you really need to send a message. The problem is that no one knows the reality of this regime's power. It has been fighting a civil war for over 2.5 years, and now, close to 2.5 years, and now we just don't know. So let's say the United States hits them a little harder and the regime begins to crumble. Keep in mind that the regime is already relocating its human and material resources to in anticipation of the attacks. That provides an opening for the rebels. And even if the United States is not intending to create a level playing field for the rebels, that could happen. And then there are consequences from that.
And that may be worse than what's in there right now.
And I'd like to add is that the United States definitely would like to see Iranian influence undermined in the region through the toppling of the Assad regime. But the United States is not about to pursue that and then hand over Syria to the jihadists. That is, the United States understands that, and hence the dilemma, hence the delay, and hence the Obama administration saying, we at least want a debate at home.
Okay, but Rami, let me bring you in because I need to understand, and I appreciate you gave a very good answer about why you think a military strike by the United States is a bad idea. But I've known you long enough to know that you certainly don't sanction the use of chemical weapons either. So if there's going to be no military strike, in your view, how do you punish the Assad regime, or what do you do to express your displeasure with the fact that these forbidden weapons have been used?
Well, you first of all use any available diplomatic or political means that you have, which will hit a roadblock in the Security Council. You look at any legal mechanisms you have, the International Criminal Court, any kind of sanctions, serious political pressure, sanctions, diplomatic responses that are all legitimate in the existing system we have. So you use all of that. Most importantly, what you do is if you're committed to bringing down the Assad regime, you give massive support to the opposition, the Syrians who have been fighting him. This should have been done a year and a half, 2 years ago. The Obama's about 2 years late in doing what he should have done, which is he said a year and a half ago that Assad has to go. He's lost his legitimacy. Well, the U.S. and Turkey and the Arabs and many others who are helping the opposition should vastly increase their support. And the U.S. can help with intelligence and satellite photography and technical aid and things like that, because the Syrians are already trying to bring down Assad. So are most of the people in the Middle East are trying to bring down these police state autocratic regimes. So it's not as if it's Assad versus Obama, that there's several 100 million Arabs who are giving up their lives to bring down these kinds of regimes. So help them, give them what they need. And this scare tactics of the Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra and these Islamic groups, these guys have no anchorage in Syrian society. They've never had any significant support at all. They only appeared there about 2 years ago. And where did they come from? They came from Iraq. Thank you very much, George Bush.
But all of what you just said, do you think that, taken in total, that represents an adequate deterrent to Syria against using these weapons again? Does it send enough of a signal?
It probably is the only practical, legitimate response that could have an impact inside the war in Syria to help tilt the balance against Assad and for the rebels. And it's the only thing that would muster international support. The Arab countries in Turkey and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and others are already giving huge support to the rebels, and that has to be enhanced, absolutely. The Syrian regime, if we go back about all these other regimes we talked about, Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and others, they're very brittle regimes. We saw Mubarak and Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. These are very thin regimes. They have troops and they will fight and kill their own people as they're doing. But at one point, they'll reach a tipping point and they will just collapse like a house of cards. And that's the way that this rebellion should have been prosecuted by the international forces, Arab and Turkish and international, who want to help. If we are saying that we're trying to enforce an international norm about chemical weapons, which we absolutely must do, why are we not enforcing other international norms, by the way, such as, for instance, the ban on Israeli settlements, such as the use of phosphorus weapons in Palestine by the Israelis, the American use of weapons in Iraq. So there's lots of norms, and the biggest norm is that the only legitimate collective military response must come from the United Nations Security Council, as Ban Ki-moon reminded us a few hours ago. So we can't cherry pick our norms. If we do that, then we're into the law of the jungle, and nobody wants that either. So
Janice wants in.
I have to disagree with my friend Rami. If you actually look at the strategy, Rami, that you've just outlined, which is enhanced support for the rebels, the United States tried that too. It tried that in Afghanistan. And the blowback from that strategy is still going on. So the strategy that, Rami, you just outlined, in fact, has terrible risks. And that's partly what's restrained the kind of support. It's also not clear that the U.S. Is the best equipped of the powers to provide this kind of support. Generally, they blunder into these situations that you rightly describe. They have no language skills. It's far better, in fact, to have the regional powers do what they're doing, who understand and are connected and know Syria far better than the United States ever has or ever will. So fundamentally, you have to engage with the question you asked, Steve. Do you care about the norm against the use of chemical weapons or not? And that's exactly what the U.S. Congress is going to have to debate over the next week.
You're saying if you care, the only response is a military strike.
Well, no. I mean, there are other responses, but in fact, they've been used. There's a sanctions regime, a very, very robust sanctions regime. It's already in place against the Syrian government. All right? There should have been, and it just defies logic, why the Obama administration has not led a global political strategy.
Well, let me pick up on that, because Stephen Starr, let me get you on this. The G20's meeting in Russia, that meeting will take place before any vote that takes place in Congress about whether or not the United States should strike militarily. Do you think that represents a potential opportunity to create a broader coalition of the willing, if you like?
Let me roll it back a little bit here. I want to get in on that last discussion. The Syrian regime does not do constructive diplomacy. It does not do constructive negotiations. The reason all the countries around Syria have not done anything is because they know this. And saying that we should leave it up to these countries, they know what the Assad regime is like, and for this reason, they won't and are not doing anything. And to go back a couple more points in terms of pinprick strikes on certain Assad military bases. If you've been watching what's been happening in Syria for the last 18 months, you'll see that rebels have been locked in fighting with Assad elements for control of bases and for control of military complexes. If the Assad regime is moving its own soldiers and that out of these areas, it represents a victory on a number of levels, I think, for the rebels. With regard to the G20 meeting, it's going to have no difference whatsoever. Vladimir Putin is not going to change his hand. He has got one card in this whole fight. I think he is not deeply linked to the Assad regime, but he doesn't want to give up Syria to the West. He will sit and he will fight for what he wants. And even as the cries get louder over the chemical weapons issue, I think he's still not going to move. Diplomacy is not going to work. Diplomacy starts and ends in Damascus, I feel, and the Assad regime has no interest in this whatsoever.
Kamran, do you think the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg represents a potential opportunity to widen this circle?
Widen it to people who the United States consider, allies, the Europeans. But it's difficult to see how the British Parliament will reconvene and say, okay, now we agree, now let's go.
No, they're not going to, but...
They're not going to. So, but getting France on board, France
is already on board,
well, today there are reports that, the French Parliament may weigh in on this whole thing. So, there's a question mark, and there's definitely, some sort of hesitance from the Hollande administration.
Well, but I don't know. The way I understand French, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, the president informs the parliament of what he's going to do. He doesn't seek advice from parliament.
Correct.
That is true, but here's the thing. Why is he still doing it? He's doing it because he wants to back off a bit.
Or he wants added legitimacy for his own position.
Of course. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, there's not much going to come out of the G20. And this is why the Obama administration knew going into the Labor Day weekend that the issue is not on the international front anymore. The issue is first having people together on the home front, and therefore the ball is in the court of Congress. And I would say that there's a lot of dissonance between the United States and its international allies, whether in the West or in the region. For example, Turkey wants more than just symbolic strikes or limited action. But it does not want to go to the extent that Saudi Arabia wants to go, which is essentially the U.S. acting as a tow truck, lifting the Assad regime out of the area so that the Saudis can deal with the Iranian threat.
Well, let me hang on a sec, Janice, because you mentioned Turkey, and Stephen is in Turkey right now. So I want to get a better sense from him since he's on the ground there. Do you think that accurately characterizes where the Turks are at on this?
Yeah, absolutely. If you read the newspapers, there's certainly a sense that Turkey is a country on the way to war, I think. But again, we need to, I think, see and listen to what Turkish people are saying. There's tremendous distrust of Western intervention in the general Middle East region in Turkey. Turks themselves do not want to get involved, generally speaking, of course. They do not want to get involved militarily in Syria. They see it as that's their problem. They should figure it out, or other Arab countries should figure it out. It's not an issue for us. But there's definitely a sense that the government is moving in a direction where it wants to at least assist military strikes on Syria. This is a major issue. Turkey is perhaps best placed, I think, to take part in some kind of a multilateral strike on Syria. There hasn't been a whole lot of open discussion, I think, between the US and Turkey. Turkey is very well equipped to partake in something like this, I think. But again, it's a difficult thing to convince the people of Turkey. There's been large-scale protests here over the summer, and the sense of rising anger, I think, against Prime Minister Erdogan and his government I think getting involved in Syria could act as just another chink to that.
Just two quick points, Steve. Actually, the G20 was an obstacle for Obama part of the crazy timing around this was he knew he had to get it over with because he knew how little support he was going to get from the G20, and he didn't want to be caught engaged in any kind of military action at the same time as the G20 was going on. So for the Obama administration, G20 was a problem. You had to jump over that fence.
Do you think that's why he asked Congress for its opinion? Because that bought him a week and a half?
I think that the timing of the G20 was a big factor, and that's why you get the timing that you currently do. Just to speak to Stephen's point, you have a gap between the Erdogan government and the street in Turkey, where the Erdogan government is pushing as hard as is conceivable for a government to push the United States, do more, but doesn't speak a lot about it at home because it's aware of the public opinion, which is opposed. In Cairo, in Egypt, you have, again, here's a government that is military-led by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, came out officially opposed to any form of military intervention. That's why this is probably one of the worst lose-lose moments for any U.S. administration in recent history.
Rami, I'd like to read you an excerpt from an editorial that appeared in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago and then get your view on that. Here's the excerpt. It says, "The reality is that if Secretary of State John Kerry and the Democrats hadn't spent so much time trying to make the false case that the Bush administration had cooked intelligence in order to start a war, perhaps he wouldn't be having such a hard time persuading a skeptical American public now." Rami, I wonder if our faith in actionable intelligence is at an historic low because, in part, of the mistakes that led up to the Iraq War, and are we seeing those chickens come home to roost right now?
I think very much the skepticism that the whole world has in the credibility of American intelligence, especially on places in the Middle East where the American presence on the ground is a bit iffy. There's very little credibility in what the United States is offering on these issues. And even now in Syria, Obama is giving a different figure for the number of people killed than Kerry is giving. So it's quite an extraordinary situation where the lack of precision and I think the confusion at the top of the American government in terms of what to do or what will happen or what happened at every level of this, the confusion is very pronounced. And the United States is falling back, unfortunately, on the legacy it has of just using its military might because it is powerful and it feels it has a moral responsibility to enforce these norms, and it's going to go out and it's going to, punch up some people and teach them a lesson. But the problem is it doesn't work. It's had to do this every 3, 4, or 5 years in a different country, and it keeps happening because the tyrants don't learn these lessons. The punitive actions that are supposed to be deterrents don't deter anybody because another tyrant comes along. And I think the United States by now, 20 years after the Cold War ended or whatever it is, the United States should realize that the Cold War ended, but there is a new constellation of powers that are standing up to the United States. And the two biggest ones in this Syria issue globally are China and Russia, and the two biggest local ones are Hezbollah and Iran. And the United States is not addressing these powers at all. It's trying to do this unilaterally. So yes, the legacy of Iraq is huge in terms of skepticism, but the United States has to overcome that by being more clear, more honest, more principled, and I think more realistic in terms of dealing with the world as it is. And absolutely, yes, enforce the norm against using chemical weapons, but do it in a much more effective way. And I think this is hard work. And frankly, I don't think American diplomacy knows how to do this. The United States doesn't know how to deal with the world other than as markets or targets. You bomb people or you trade with them, and that's all you do. And this is a real problem. It's a historical, cultural problem that the United States has, and it happens president after president after president.
Kamran, I want to ask you about that word you used in your very first answer, which was seemingly. I want to know if you're 100% satisfied with the intelligence which says sarin gas was used and the Assad regime is responsible.
I'm 100% satisfied that it was used. I'm not 100% satisfied that, well, let me actually step back and say, when we say Assad regime, what do we mean by that? Because right now, we're not looking at a conventional regime. This regime has lost command and control over its own country. And so who is to say that this was actually an order given by Assad or someone in the middle, or was a local decision in that area? We just don't know. It may be that it came from the very top. It may be that it came from somewhere else. And so we just don't know.
Should that matter?
Well, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the gas was used, the red line has been breached, and therefore there are going to be consequences of that, and we're going to find out next week what those consequences are. But again, you see, this is the point that, and I want to disagree respectfully with Rami, is that I don't think that the United States doesn't understand diplomacy or does not engage with it. It's not about what you want. It's about what you can do given the chessboard. And the United States is negotiating with the Russians. It is talking to the Iranians behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, the Iranians have a lot to lose if the Syrian regime were to fall. And Russia does not want the one card it has in the region to use as leverage against the United States. And frankly speaking, the Kremlin would be very happy if the United States was mired into another war in the Middle East.
Right. Janice.
Russia is the big winner here, that there's no question. Let's come back to the intelligence, right? So part of the way out of the box is the UN inspectors are going to say something very shortly, because they need a preliminary period of 48 to 72 hours just to determine if a chemical agent was used. And
did they get access to what they needed to make that determination?
Yes,
You think
yes,
they did? Okay.
I think they did. I don't. Depending on what you use, but yes is the answer to that. And I think they will come out very, very shortly in the next day or two, and they will affirm that chemical weapons were used. That still leaves your big question: who used them? So what are we relying on here? Well, we're relying on intercepted communications, according to the United States. Conversations, and this speaks to Karen's points, between senior military officers apparently screaming at somebody else, oh my God, how did this happen, right? There's also aerial photographs, surveillance photographs of Syrian military at these sites, chemical weapons sites, 48 hours before. Now, that's what the United States says. Why should we believe them is a very fair question after everything that's happened. So this is going to be the defining moment. How much intelligence does the U.S. release? How open are they? How transparent are they? Are they willing to compromise some of their sources and their technology? And my hunch is that as the debate in Congress ramps up, if they're not more open and they're not more transparent about the quality of the intelligence, they're going to be in big trouble. Never mind in the world, but in Congress.
Let me ask a really awful question.
Yes.
But you know that all of you people have thought about this at somewhere along the way. Whenever there are terrible conflicts around the world, I'm not alleging this, I'm only asking the question. It's not beyond the pale for one side to fire on its own people in order to create an international furor that will help bring in this case, the United States, and help them fight their war. Is there any evidence/suspicion that's at play here? Kamran.
Well, we live in a world of social media, and so which has sort of become the parallel media. And in the social media, there's a lot of clamor about the rebels using. In fact, there was some report I saw yesterday quoting an AP journalist, which said that some of the rebel groups were delivered chemical weapons, and the conspiracy theorists out there are fingering the Saudi intelligence chief, Prince Bandar, and saying that he was the one who provided them. I can see the intent, but we live in a world where we do not go by intent only. We must see capability, and we must have hard evidence. I've not come across anything called hard evidence or even capability on the point of on the part of the Saudis to deliver these weapons. In theory, yes, this is possible, but this is even murkier than the idea that that there is evidence that, as Janice was saying, that links it back up the chain to Assad.
But Stephen, the Russians have come out and said, why would the Syrian regime use chemical weapons knowing full well that crosses Barack Obama's red line and thereby inviting America to get into a war which so far it's managed to avoid? They're using that argument to suggest, or at least put out there, the notion that the rebel side did this to its own people in order to create an international clamor. What do you think of that argument?
The point the Assad regime has been making for the last 30 months is that why would we kill our own people? Why would we kill our own civilians? There's two very interesting points here, I think, to be made. When in May 2012, there were UN observers on the ground in Syria, in Homs, a short distance from the town of Hule, when a massacre of up to 500 people took place. It's not unprecedented that the Syrian regime would act even as there are international observers, inspectors on the ground. We all know that there was a team of UN chemical weapons inspectors in Damascus, a short trip, perhaps 6 or 7 kilometers from where these chemical weapons were allegedly used. There's another issue I think to point out here. We have no sense in the English language media of just how strong the Assad regime feels it is in Damascus. If you were in Damascus today, you get a very, very different picture of what exactly is happening and who is in control and how strong the Assad regime is. From that perspective, I bring this up because if the Assad regime feels like it is essentially going to win this war at some point in the future, which it does believe, I think, it could use chemical weapons. It feels that we can use chemical weapons. There's no major consequence to that. They feel that the U.S. government will not act, that the international community won't act. It hasn't acted for the last 30 years. But this is a very important issue. It's called, this Damascus bubble, that the Assad regime feels it's right and the Assad regime feels it's going to win.
Janice.
Yeah, just very quickly. Of course, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. And in fact, a group of rebels crossed the border into Turkey, and Turkish police found chemical agents in the possession of the rebels that crossed into Turkey 2 weeks ago. But what else was needed here, Steve? First of all, you needed a missile system that you could deploy. Secondly, we know some of these missiles were fired from the Damascus-Homs highway. So that's like saying that on the 401, rebels would be able to penetrate the 401, put mobile missile launchers in place.
So unlikely.
Yeah, so the odds are overwhelmingly against. But that's not going to be good enough, and that's why I say that now that Obama has decided to go this route in Congress, he is certainly going to have to release the intelligence and they are briefing the Senate Intelligence Committee now, and they may have to go further. They may have to actually release the intercepted communications, which their National Security Agency captures, just as our CSE captures. They may have no choice but to release that if they're going to persuade skeptical people that they have ironclad evidence.
And Rami, let me get you then to comment on the next part of the story, which is that clearly, with the American president's asking his Congress for a thumbs up on this, if you like, he's bought himself another week and a half. The U.S., at the most, the U.S. has, I guess, slowed down the drumbeat for war for the moment. I wonder if you could tell me what you think the Syrian government can actually do that's constructive with this extra potential week and a half that it has now before any military action might happen.
If you go back over the last 2.5 years almost of this war in Syria, it's very clear what the Syrian government strategy is, what the Iranian strategy, the Russian, the rebel Syrians. Everybody's approach is absolutely clear. And there's no chance that the Syrian government is going to do anything different than what it has done for 2.5 years. It's going to fight to keep itself in power. The really critical thing about this battle in Syria, this war, is that it's about Syria, but it's the biggest proxy war of our generation. This is bigger than Vietnam. It's the biggest proxy war. It has everybody in the region involved. All the big powers in the world are involved, and they're already involved. The Iranians, the Americans, the Turks, the Saudis, the Russians are all giving weapons and money and support. So this is already a global war. It's the biggest proxy war, and it's an existential war.
Who's winning it, Rami? If it's a proxy war, who's winning?
Well, it's a draw. I don't think anybody's winning. It's a bloody draw. There's 6 million Syrians who are either displaced internally, 4 million, and 2 million have been sent refugees outside the country. It's the biggest humanitarian catastrophe of our time. And it's going to get a lot worse with an American strike or any other kind of strike. So the key thing I think to understand is nobody's going to change significantly because everybody sees this as an existential conflict. They cannot afford to lose. These are like two gladiators in a ring, in an arena. One of them is going to win and one of them is going to die. And there's no chance, I think, of a negotiated settlement now. It could have been a year or a year and a half ago. But today, there's absolutely no chance, I think, of Assad and the rebels sitting down unless the external parties on both sides make it clear to their allies in Syria that they have to find a negotiated transition. But Assad will not negotiate his own downfall.
Right.
So unfortunately, I don't see anything that Assad's going to do differently. The world is going to help the rebels much more now. And we're going to see an escalation of the fighting, I fear, and there's going to be catastrophes. Jordan and Lebanon are already straining with the refugees that they absorb. There's just nothing good about this. Everything we see is terrible, and it's hard to find anybody that you can say is not partly to blame for being part of this catastrophe.
Kamran, then Janice.
Well, I think to answer your question about who's winning and who's losing, well, clearly Assad, until this latest chemical weapon crisis, wasn't losing. In fact, he was taking back territories from the rebels. His forces were, and which sort of then raises the question of, well, why engage in a chemical weapon strike when you're on the upswing? It's definitely a proxy war, and I agree with Rami. I would add that this is a geosectarian war, a geopolitical sectarian war between Saudi Arabia and their Sunni allies, and Iran and its Shiite allies, and the United States is caught in between.
So it's geopolitical, it's sectarian as well.
Yeah, and that's
why a
why
civil war.
It's a civil war. It's a regional war. It's a regional war, and therefore the stakes are high from the point of view of the Assad regime. They have no faith in any negotiated settlement because the United States can't guarantee their safety. They have seen what has happened in Iraq, and they know that if they conceded ground, if they backed off, or gave up some concessions, then they are making themselves too vulnerable. They're putting their own lives at risk. Forget about their political and financial interest. We're talking about lives because they see, the jihadists basically waiting to slit their throats.
Janice.
Just to, first of all, agree with Rami, we're in all-out war. And the space and time for negotiation is gone, frankly, in terms of the factions inside Syria. That's the key point that makes this so tough. So if you're looking for a way to deal with the Assad regime right now, which responsible diplomats should be looking for, Rami's analysis takes us to a point where we say, there's none. Assume the world backs off right now and provides extra military support to the middle-of-the-road rebels, which is a very tough proposition. What conceivable reason does Assad then have not to use chemical weapons again? This is do or die for him, as Rami just said. So that's the core of the dilemma here. It's difficult to imagine what will restrain Assad if outsiders take the route of arming the rebels, which is the route that Rami wants us to go.
Well,
that's where we're stuck, all of us.
This has been one of the most toxic brews I think any of us have seen in a long time. And here are the numbers. Control room, bring up board 4 if you could, please. This is these are almost 2 million individual lives that have been adversely affected because of this. Former Syrian citizens have now 700,000 plus gone to Lebanon, more than 500,000 to Jordan, almost 500,000 to Turkey, more than 150,000 to Iraq, more than 100,000 to Egypt. These numbers all courtesy the UN Refugee Agency. And Stephen, I get you're in Turkey, where nearly 500,000 Syrian citizens are now in flight. Can you give us some sense about what these countries are able to do for these Syrian citizens who are fleeing for their lives and suddenly now find themselves, in your case, there inside Turkey?
I think we need to remember firstly as well that these are registered numbers. There are hundreds of thousands more of unregistered refugees that have fled to various countries bordering Syria and to Egypt. And this is an important thing to figure out here as well. I spoke to some UN people who are working close to the Syrian border inside Turkey quite recently. They are preparing for a 5-year operation. They're preparing to be based there for the next 5 years. There's a sense that they have, at least, that this conflict is going nowhere for a very, very, very long time. I think Rami would probably speak to this too, but Lebanon is in a very, very tricky position right now. There have been a number of sectarian car bombings over the last couple of weeks and during the summer. The deadliest car bombing in Lebanon's history took place two weeks ago, all related directly or indirectly to what's happening in Syria. Things are going to get worse in Syria. I think that to leave Syria as it is right now is the worst option, and there are no good options left in Syria. That's clear. But I feel that the world can no longer wash its hands of what's happening. The Turks aren't going to move by itself. The Iraqi government says too that its hands are tied. Lebanon doesn't have a functioning government, and Jordan also is looking over its shoulder at Muslim Brotherhood presence there. They're all looking to the US. None of them are going to act. They're all afraid of the Assad regime, and it's simply going to get worse.
Rami, I should ask you, because fully 700,000 plus of the 2 million refugees officially, Stephen's well right to point out that the official count, are now in Lebanon. How overwhelmed is this country right now in terms of trying to deal with that?
It's a very difficult situation, and they're really scrambling to try to figure out what to do. There's Syrians everywhere in Lebanon. You see them begging in the streets, some of them in makeshift camps and abandoned homes. There's a lot of UN agencies, Lebanese government agencies, NGOs. Everybody's trying to help. There's about 2,000 or 3,000 that are crossing every day now, and people expect this to increase. And surveys that have been done in Jordan and in Syria both show similar negative reactions among the Lebanese and the Jordanian populations: resentment, anger. The Syrians are seen as hurting the economy, taking away jobs, lowering wages, being a security threat. It's just every dimension of the refugee flows in Lebanon and Jordan in particular are negative, and they're going to get much worse. And you mentioned the 2 million almost refugees that have left the country. There's another 4 million internally displaced inside Syria who've had to move. And these are people who are living off UN food handouts, basically. So, and this will increase very quickly, probably if there is a strike of some sort. And so how to deal with these issues has baffled everybody. People are scrambling to provide humanitarian aid. The solution ultimately is a political resolution of the underlying conflict, and nobody knows how to do that as well. So what we're seeing here is something that is unprecedented, I think, in modern history. A war that is so global in context, but local in implementation, that is ideological, sectarian, ethnic, religious, has every dimension to it, including terror groups, and nobody has a handle on how to actually make progress. So I'm very concerned that there's no solution other than fighting it to the finish, and one of these sides is going to collapse soon, and we don't know who it is.
Janice, I've got 30 seconds left. Since you're the one person here who is unambiguously pro-strike,
very, very reluctant.
I understand.
Yes.
Can the U.S. do that and not get mired in deeper?
No, sure it can. Again, it depends very much on what your analysis of two things.
I got 30 seconds.
What does Assad do and what does Hezbollah do? Both of those are explosive. The third thing is, again, look at the failure of global diplomacy, that we do not have a massive humanitarian effort for these 6 million people that we're talking about. Where is everybody on summer vacation, Steve, while this is going on? What a failure of diplomacy by the people who are now struggling with the consequences.
I thank all four of you for coming in tonight and helping us understand this awful problem better. Rami Khouri from Beirut, the American University of Beirut. Stephen Starr in Istanbul. Revolt in Syria is his book. We had him on the program last year talking about that. Stephen, good to see you again. Kamran Bukhari from Stratfor. Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs here in our studios in Toronto. Thanks, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.